Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's Carcass Management Basics. Please note that all lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will provide you with instructions on how to ask a question at that time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen and choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. If you require technical assistance, please send a note to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Liz Clark. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Clark with the Professional Development Services branch staff, and I'd also like to thank you for joining us today for the webinar on Carcass Management Basics. Our speaker today is Lori Miller. Lori is a licensed professional engineer with over 30 years of experience managing a variety of projects and programs aimed at reducing environmental impacts from industrial, military, and government activities. Lori currently serves as a Senior Staff Officer Environmental Engineer for USDA APHIS in Riverdale, Maryland. She focuses on planning and preparedness for animal health emergency response, especially related to the management of infected carcasses and biosecurity. And with that, I'll hand the webinar over to Lori.
Thank you so much, Liz. Welcome, everyone. I very much appreciate your spending the next hour with us. So what I'd like to go over with you today are a handful of topics related to just basic carcass management concepts. An hour isn't really enough to cover, all the material, but hopefully this will get you started. So we're going to talk briefly about the animal disease outbreak emergency response process that we go through here at APHIS. I'm going to give you an example of that process and how it plays out in the U.S., some alternatives for carcass management with pros, cons, costs, and other considerations. We're going to talk briefly about transport issues, storage, and then I'm going to let you know about a couple tools that are available to help this. So the response process. This graphic, I realize, is unreadable to you and not necessary to read it, but just to let you know that during highly pathogenic avian influenza in 2015, this was developed to help people understand the process. And so the process involves detecting an infection, and so that usually happens when the producer, the farmer, the grower notices an abnormal amount of mortality in their herd or their flock. And although this slide says highly pathogenic avian influenza or HPAI, it's not limited to AI. It could also apply to diseases like foot and mouth disease where stamping out is employed, and I'll explain that a little more in a moment. If the producer feels that there is increased mortality in their herd or flock, they'll call in their veterinarian who may notice that the signs are consistent with a reportable disease, and so they will contact the state animal health official who may bring in APHIS. They'll take samples, and once that's confirmed to be a high consequence animal disease, then they will quarantine the infected premises, control movements in a 3-kilometer zone, do surveillance in a 10-kilometer radius zone. They'll appraise the flock for its market, or the herd for their market value. Then APHIS will send a team to euthanize the animals. Once they're depopulated or euthanized, then the producer or grower generally is compensated at that point for the value of their birds, and then APHIS pays for the rest of the response. And that would include disposing of the dead animals, going back into the barns and either cleaning and disinfecting with liquid disinfectants and soap and water and whatnot, or using a dry method, which involves sweeping everything out down to the bare bones and then heating it. Testing the surfaces to be sure that the virus is inactivated, and after a 21-day waiting period that's required by international regulations, then the animals can be restocked, and the farm then continues to maintain strict biosecurity so they don't have a recurrence. So if we're talking about avian influenza and birds, it's relatively easy to imagine that you can dispose of those animals, even if there are a lot of them. And we did prove that to be true in 2015 during our response. But when we're talking about something like foot and mouth disease, which affects cows, pigs, goats, sheep, larger animals, then it's not so easy to dispose of that greater amount of material. And so APHIS has plans and procedures for, in case of an FMD outbreak. And the strategy for that is if it's a type 1, very small outbreak, like one farm or a few small holdings in a very localized area, that would be a focal FMD outbreak. And stamping out would likely be the first approach. And stamping out means that all the animals at that infected premises are euthanized and disposed of. Sometimes, and this has been done in the past in other countries in particular, the farms surrounding that infected premises, even though they haven't come up positive yet, if they're considered dangerous contacts, they may also be depopulated. So, there could be a considerable amount of material that has to be disposed of, even with a type 1 focal outbreak. But if that outbreak in large animals spreads to a region or nationally or even North American in scope, then the strategy will move away from stamping out and towards other strategies such as vaccination or other methods that would not require depopulation and disposal of all those animals. So what do our regulations say about this, about disposal? Well, APHIS at 9 CFR 53.4 has some regulations that pertain to foot and mouth disease and other communicable diseases of livestock or poultry. And this regulation has been in place for many decades, and it calls for that animals infected with or exposed to disease shall be killed promptly after appraisal, and that's usually 24 hours, is the expectation, and disposed of by burial or burning. And that disposal piece has traditionally been thought of occurring in the next 24 hours, unless otherwise specifically provided by the administrator at his or her discretion. So that's what's on the books currently: stamp out, burning, or burial. And many other countries have a similar protocol. And although I didn't have time today to talk to you about lessons learned from other countries, I can tell you that in 2001, when the UK had their foot and mouth disease outbreak, they found that burning was catastrophic. They had to evacuate communities for weeks at a time. There was a huge public outcry. They moved to burial, and those burial sites, a single burial site, they did they moved everything to a single burial site and did it there near a landfill, and they're still monitoring the contamination in the groundwater to this day, 17 years later. Japan had an outbreak in 2010 where they couldn't find enough burial sites, and so they had to vaccinate the animals until they could find places to bury them, and then they would dispose of them. And in 2011, South Korea also had an outbreak where they had 4,500 burial sites, which a third of them failed, meaning in the rainy season they broke open. They had to go back and dig those up. There was massive groundwater contamination. People lost their jobs, and it was really a huge catastrophe. So we don't want to repeat all that. And so here's what it would look like if we tried to implement that strategy of stamping out and burning or burial. And I'm just going to focus on burial in this example in the U.S. So let's go to the heartland, Nebraska. This is a map from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, and I believe this is their 2010 census. Each blue dot represents 10,000 cattle or calves. And as you can see, the county I have highlighted to the eastern part of the state has quite a dense concentration of animals in that section. So zooming into that area in eastern Nebraska near Wisner, let's just say that there's an infected premises where that X is. And from the satellite imagery of Wisner, it appears that there are quite a few cattle feedlots in that 3-kilometer circle that I've drawn there, the black circle, and then quite a few more, which would be in the 10-kilometer zone. So if we were going to do that approach of stamping out both infected and exposed, we could be stamping out quite a few farms in that area. But let's forget that. Let's say we're just dealing with one farm. We're also going to assume that that single farm with the X has 50,000 head. And that's not that big by, feedlot standards. It's not unusual in Kansas and Texas to have feedlots of 100,000 or 120,000 head of cattle. We're just talking about 50,000 here, and let's see how this plays out. And I'd like to mention a note here. For those of you who are joining us and are planning to participate in the full-scale FMD exercise occurring in May 2018, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to not assume that you're just going to depopulate all the animals in 24 hours and dispose of them in 48. You need to work through the numbers, and I'll walk you through those on the next slides, because you will likely find that you can't dispose of the animals in a timely manner and that you have to move to other options, whether it's vaccination or some other approach to minimize the number of animals that are destroyed. So, focusing then on our single infected premises of 50,000 head, and let's say they're just about ready for market and they're 1,200 pounds each, so that's 50,000 times 1,200 is 30,000 tons of material. And that's just the animals. It's not counting manure or other feed or other products that might also have to be disposed of. So you can, let's say that they want to bury on farm, and hopefully you can see in the picture in the upper left-hand corner there a feedlot, and the animals are in pens, and there are typically 100 or 200 animals per pen. So you can't just bury them in the pens. There's not enough room to get equipment in there and do what you need to do. So you're going to have to bury them elsewhere on the farm, assuming you have the space to do it. So that also means you're going to have to get them from the pen to however you're going to euthanize them, captive bolt, and then once they're down, then you have to put them in a vehicle of some sort and move them to the burial pit. Well, let's suppose that your farm roads are strong enough to carry a 20-ton dump truck, which is probably optimistic. But let's say they could, and that this large dump truck could hold 20 tons of material. So the total weight of the dump truck is a lot more than that, but you can put 20 tons of cow material, cows in there. At that rate, it would take 1,500 loads just to move them from the pens to the burial site. If you can load a truck and disinfect it every half hour around the clock, it would take you 750 hours or more than a month, 24 hours a day. If you're working 10 hours a day, which is a more realistic scenario, it would take you 2.5 months. So the idea that you're going to depopulate and dispose within 24 hours or 48 hours, not possible, not reasonable. Have to do the calculations. And, thinking about this, if you have just taken 2.5 months to put those animals down and move them to the burial site, FMD is sort of like the flu. They will have gotten better by then. And so you would be going through and destroying animals that are perfectly healthy again. So this whole stamping out concept, especially for foot and mouth disease, is less less practical than it once was when the regulations were put in place. So let's talk about the burial site. So 50,000 head at 8 feet tail to nose, that's about 400,000 feet or 76 miles of trench that would have to be excavated. It's not realistic to think that you're going to lay them end to end. More likely you're going to, pile them maybe 3 deep in the trench. Even then, you'll be needing 25 miles of trench to be excavated. That is going to take a while. If you're using more of a pit instead of a trench, it's going to take 64 acres just for the area where you bury the animals, but then you're going to need side slopes that prevent cave-ins and a buffer zone to move equipment. So you're going to need to double that to about 120 acres, which was validated during the Japan's 2010 outbreak. That's what they found. And that 50,000 head of cattle, once they're buried, as they decompose, they're going to generate about 2,400 gallons per day of leachate. And leachate is the liquid that comes from the breakdown. Animals are anywhere from 60 to 80% water, so as they decompose, that water is released. A number of other chemicals, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's 200 times stronger than sewage that would, come from residential zones. So what happens when animals are buried in the subsurface? Looking at this picture, you can see the burial pit. We can see the burial pit there in the center of the screen. The animals are underground. As they decompose, the liquid leachate comes from the bottom of the pit, and it migrates down through the soil to the water table. The water table flows generally towards streams where it discharges. How fast the leachate gets from the bottom of the burial pit to the water table depends on the distance. So if you bury it 2 feet from the water table, it's going to get there much faster than if you bury 300 feet from the water table. And that's very site-specific, depends on what region of the country, what particular soils you have on your site. And again, the leachate levels for nitrogen are over 12,000 milligrams per liter, and phosphorus is more than 1,500 milligrams per liter. Another factor that plays in the soils is the type of soil. So if you have sandy soil, it's going to move much more quickly than it will if you have clay soil. So again, it's very much dependent on where this burial site is. There are also regulations in states. Many states specify what is the minimum separation you need to have between a drinking water well and a burial pit. Some states require as little as 100 feet. So, in the worst case scenario, you could have relatively sandy soils 2 feet from the water table and only 100 feet from the drinking water well. So the likelihood of the levels of nitrogen and phosphorus dropping very much is low. They'll probably be pretty concentrated by the time it gets to that well. On the other hand, if you're a mile from the burial pit with your well and you're in deep clay soils, then you're not likely to have such an impact. In any event, the drinking water standard for nitrogen is 10 milligrams per liter and phosphorus is 1. Bottom line, the burial pit is producing leachate that's 1,000 times the concentration allowed in drinking water. And there are some other issues with burial sites on farms. One is many locations require that the burial pit be recorded on the property deed. And so that means that when the owner goes to sell that property, they may get a lower sales price because of the burial pit. Or if they want to, eliminate that concern, they might have to dig up the burial pit and clean it up, which is extremely expensive. And worst of all, if the burial pit contaminates someone's drinking water, whether it's a private well at a single house or whether it's a public drinking water supply, that property owner will be responsible for cleaning up that contamination, and that can be extremely expensive. So why is nitrogen a problem? Why do we care? As I said, the EPA standard for nitrates in drinking water is 10. The burial site is generating 1,000 times that, and high levels of nitrates in drinking water may cause blue baby syndrome, which can be fatal to infants. In addition, the water table often discharges to streams, and excess nitrogen is toxic to aquatic life, depletes dissolved oxygen in the water, and stimulates aquatic plants or eutrophication. And so what those last three bullets basically mean is that you're choking out your local trout stream so that trout will no longer survive there. And so let's go back to our Nebraska site near Wisner. We had, drawn a circle just to the, in the lower left portion of that map on the upper left there, and that's where our infected premises was, and that's where our zone was. So are those soils suitable, for burial? Well, the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, has a wonderful online tool called the Web Soil Survey. And that tool enables you to go in, enter your location, or click on a map, and ask it to run the model for suitability for burial of mass animal carcasses in an emergency. And when you run that model, the results come back in a color-coded map shown on the lower right. And green indicates that the soils are suitable, yellow is somewhat suitable, and red is not suitable. And as you notice, the lower left-hand portion of that color-coded map is almost all red, which means that our site in Nebraska wouldn't even if they wanted to spend 2.5 months digging a 25-mile trench, the soils aren't suitable and they wouldn't be allowed to, presumably. So what are our alternatives? We're going to look at those alternatives. As we mentioned, our regulations say burning or burial or other method. We'll talk about burning, which was found to be catastrophic in the UK. We'll talk more about burial, the pros and the cons, costs and considerations. We used composting to a great extent for the avian influenza outbreak in the U.S. in 2015. We'll talk about that, as well as other options like rendering, incineration, landfill, and above-ground burial. And we'll go into each of those now in more detail. So burning is on-farm pyres, like is shown in the lower left-hand photograph, air curtain incinerators. So an open pyre is basically a big pile of wood and cows, just like you would build a fire in your fireplace, except way bigger, and maybe some gasoline or diesel fuel poured on it and ignited and kept burning until all those cows are gone, which could be weeks. An alternative to that would be the air curtain incinerators, and those are shown in the two center photographs. The one on the left is in a trench, and the one on the right is in a box. But basically what that is that orange tube has jets of air, and the fuel is added in the trench to the debris, and then that air jet keeps the emissions from polluting the environment as much, and it helps the fire burn more, burn hotter. It doesn't eliminate smoke, as you can see on the right, or another option for on-farm burning would be a mobile crematorium like the unit sketched on the far right. So the advantages to doing on-farm burning is that it's on the farm. You don't have to transport infected material anywhere. It may inactivate pathogens, although possibly not very well. If you're using an open pyre, then you're not likely to inactivate all the pathogens, and that all of that smoke that's generated may very well carry untreated pathogens elsewhere. But either way, it does take the material down to ash, and so that greatly reduces the volume. On the downside, as I described, it could be a biosecurity risk, transporting active pathogens elsewhere, which you don't want. It's not sustainable, and so sustainability in this context is defined as a low risk of environmental contamination and a useful end product. So in this case, you have relatively high air pollution and no beneficial byproduct. So that's not very sustainable. The public may be very much opposed, especially to the open pyres as they were in the UK. It's inefficient in that it takes quite a while and a lot of resources to get those cows to burn down to ash. It's a challenge to operate in the sense that you need people who know how to keep that fire burning and prevent the fire from spreading. And you do have regulatory limitations, both from the perspective of air emissions as well as for fire safety. The next column indicates time and cost. And so it takes relatively a lot of time to process those animals. And relative to other options, it's relatively expensive as well. So the X's represent time and the dollar signs cost. Other considerations, the air curtain units and the mobile crematoria definitely reduce the emissions, but they're also, they don't have very big capacity, so you cannot burn very many pounds per hour. We found in 2015 that those air curtain units, like the one, the third one there in the box, only could process about 5 tons per day. The mobile crematoria that we've tested can process about 10 tons per day. But when you consider that we were pulling 100 to 200 tons of hens out of the laying houses in high path, that's not very much. And it certainly isn't very much for FD-sized animals. Burial. So we talked a little bit about that already. It's defined as an unlined trench or pit at least 6 feet below the ground surface and more commonly about 10 to 12 feet deep. It's deemed as a positive because you can do it on the farm and don't have to transport. And everybody knows how to dig a hole, at least they think they do, although once you start using heavy equipment to dig a big hole, it's harder than you would think to keep it from collapsing and to keep from hitting water. But relative to the other options, it's easy. The downside is that you have a public health risk from groundwater contamination. There may be biosecurity risk if the pathogens survive in the water and then that water, groundwater is used to water animals. We don't know, and so there's more research going. We do know from Wisconsin High Path AI in 2015 that there was evidence of virus in the groundwater below infected premises. We don't know if that virus would have been viable. It was not viable at the time we did the testing, but it was found. So more research is needed in that area. Burial is not sustainable because it doesn't have a useful byproduct. There may be regulatory and practical limitations, like we pointed out earlier, and it limits future land use. You may not be able to develop that property or sell it as easily in the future. But it is relatively quick, and I've indicated that it's relatively inexpensive, but there's an asterisk there. It's inexpensive to bury them, but it's really expensive to dig them up later. And I can't tell you how many times around the world and in the U.S. we've had problems and may have had to consider, or in other countries they've actually had to dig up those burial sites. So not a good prospect. And, you know, I don't want to tell you that burial is never an option. That's not true. It may be viable for relatively small numbers of animals or even large numbers if you have the right soil conditions and the right groundwater, but it is very site-specific. And you can't tell without consulting with experts, and those experts are found in the state environmental agencies. And so I strongly encourage anyone on the phone who is with a state animal health agency that you, day one, when you have an outbreak and you think you're going to have disposal, bring in your state environmental folks. They can help you. They already know where it's safe to bury or not, and they know what landfills are, you know, good options, and they can help you find those disposal sites. Composting is another option. We used it. We had 50 million birds approximately that were destroyed during 2015. 85% of them were composted. So this is an option that can be used for large amounts of biomass. And the definition of composting is a specially designed mounds of wood chips, which provide carbon, and carcasses, which provide nitrogen, with the right amount of moisture and air for microbial processes to occur. And that breaks down the mortalities and results in a beneficial soil amendment. In 2015, it took about a month to break down the birds completely. For large animals like cows, it can take 3 to 6 months. But it is possible for all of the above. The positive aspects of composting is that it's safe. It doesn't contaminate air or groundwater. It's sustainable in that it takes relatively few resources and generates a beneficial byproduct. It can be done on farm, and it's relatively easy to implement with a caveat. The pros and cons for these alternatives were taken from a comprehensive matrix, which I'll show you in a few slides. So there weren't any significant negatives. There were some negatives. They were just not significant. So as you can see, it can take a while and can be relatively expensive. At least it was in 2015. But that cost will come down because we have revised our protocols. So it should become less expensive in the future. But the major consideration for composting is that you must have a subject matter expert to ensure the piles are properly constructed. If they're not, we found that they would not heat up, they would attract flies, and it required people to go back and rebuild the piles later, which just prolonged the time that the farm was under. So it is much better and more efficient to get the subject matter expert in there at the beginning. Doing it right the first time definitely paid off. Rendering is our next topic. Rendering is the process of taking the animals to a rendering plant where they are ground up and cooked. And the water portion of about 60% is driven off as water or steam, and then 20% of the material is separated out as a fat or tallow portion, which can be used in a variety of products or as biodiesel to run the rendering plant. And the remaining 20% is meat or bone meal, which is often used for pet foods or animal feed. In the case of infected animals, it's unlikely that it would go for pet food, even though the rendering process does get hot enough to inactivate the pathogens such as avian influenza or FMD. So the positives of rendering are that it's safe. It's a permitted facility that has all sorts of environmental safeguards built in, so it protects human health and the environment. It's sustainable because it provides a beneficial byproduct and, in fact, can generate its own electricity. It reduces the volume of the waste material significantly. It can handle, some plants are designed for 1 million pounds per day or more. Of course, that capacity might not be available for an emergency because they may be processing their routine customers, but still they are able to handle a lot of material, very efficient in terms of how quickly they can process, readily implemented because the plants already exist and have trained operators, and they're already permitted for carcass management. And the photos at the bottom, you can see the one on the left is the hide removal going on. I know you can't read that little teeny tiny flow chart in the middle, which is showing the process, but they can be very high-tech, highly controlled and processes, as is shown on the right. So the downside of rendering is that the animals would have to be transported off-site. And although we can safely transport, and in the U.S. we do transport medical waste up and down the roads all day, every day, the idea of transporting infected animals flies in the face of the idea of a quarantine. And that's the whole point of what we're doing when we, have a quarantine in a control zone. So the idea of transporting is something that responders have a very hard time being comfortable with, even though it can be done safely. It's more of a perception. The time to do rendering is pretty low. You just load them in a truck and haul them over to the rendering plant, assuming it's close enough. Dump it in the grinder, and it gets processed. So pretty quick. It's moderately expensive compared to other alternatives because you do have that transport cost, and you may have fees for the renderer to process the materials. But probably the biggest consideration here is that renderers may be unwilling to accept the infected carcasses because of customer perceptions. Even though it can be done safely, even though their process kills all of the FMD and AI viruses, as has been shown in lab results, just the idea that infected animals went in means people may not be willing to buy that dog food and feed it to their pets. So that's a challenge we're working on with the Renderers Association, and hopefully we'll overcome in the future. Incineration is another option, and this is combustion of carcasses in a fixed permitted facility at approximately 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And that facility has emissions control, so that means very low air emissions, and it may generate electricity, and even not only to power its own plant, but to sell back to the grid. And so the photos here are of an exercise where spent hens were being loaded into these boxes on a pallet, the boxes were then disinfected. They were loaded onto this truck, taken to a waste-to-energy facility, and that's a picture of them being loaded into the incinerator hopper. It was deemed to be feasible and would be used in the future if the need arose. This is also being investigated in the state of New York. So incineration like this is safe because the safeguards to human health and the environment are already built in through the permitting and construction process. It inactivates pathogens, including prions that cause mad cow disease. It's sustainable when the plant is used to generate electricity, vastly reduces the volume of the waste, generally accepted by the public, highly efficient, and readily implemented at plants that are pre-trained operators. The downside is that you have to transport off-site. There may not be very many of these in agricultural areas, and sometimes because they're already using their capacity to serve their existing clients, they may not have a lot of room to take emergency waste. And so it can take a little while because you have to package the materials into these boxes and then or barrels and then transport them over to the incinerator, and it may be quite costly for the fees to dispose in that manner. And once again, the companies may be hesitant to accept the infected materials. Landfill is the second to the last option I want to talk about. Landfill is placing the carcasses in an engineered, constructed landfill that has a liner at the bottom that doesn't let the leachate out. It's then pumped out of the bottom and recirculated or sent to ponds where it might go to a wastewater treatment plant or be otherwise treated. And then any methane gas that's produced is captured and used to generate electricity. So it already has all of the human and environmental safety controls built into it, so it's safe. It's sustainable if they're generating electricity. Every community around the country has a landfill nearby. I mean, they're just highly available. Depending on the size of the landfill, it may be able to take a lot of material. It's very quick to implement. All you have to do is load the materials in the truck and dump them at the other end. So quite fast, assuming you already have the landfill lined up and they're willing to accept the waste. Generally, the public accepts the idea. I mean, that's where they send their household trash. It's efficient and readily implemented. But some of the downside is that there's a lot of concern. We found this in 2015 about the landfills were worried that avian influenza was going to survive in the landfill, in the leachate, and they were going to send it out to a pond or spray it back on the landfill, and that it was somehow going to reinfect healthy flocks. Well, we have since done a risk assessment on that, and the findings are that it is a very low risk if certain mitigations are followed. And there's much more information on that, just not enough time to talk about it here. Also, you have to transport, which, again, folks don't like that, and denial of use. Landfills are built usually to serve a community, and so they have a certain capacity that they're licensed for. If we fill it up with emergency materials, then they no longer have that capacity to serve their community. So that's what denial of use is in this context. It's quick, it's relatively cheap, but the big consideration is that, again, companies may be hesitant to accept these infected materials. And finally, you know, given that everybody reaches for burial and you know, that's what they think of doing, but it has so many disadvantages, is there a safer way to do burial? The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, led by Gary Flory, is working on an innovative technology that we're calling Aboveground Burial. And it involves digging, rather than a 12-foot trench, digging a shallow 18-inch trench with an 8-inch or so layer of wood chips in the bottom. You then layer the carcasses on top and cover it over with the excavated soil and then plant it with grass or some other non-invasive species. And preliminary studies have shown that within 3 months the carcasses are highly degraded. And so it has the advantages of giving you a lot more distance to the water table. It has that carbon, that wood chip layer that helps soak up the leachate, and it breaks it down. So unlike the deep burial, where decades later, if that, you know, burial site is inadvertently dug into for development or whatever, there were so many stories of finding, you know, intact carcasses that look like they were just buried today. So this helps deal with some of those issues, and you know, we greatly look forward to fully validating this process. At this point, it looks like it's going to be safe, certainly a lot safer than deep burial. It can be done on farm, readily available, same equipment that you would be using for burial, quick. Theoretically, the public would accept this concept if it's safer, and relatively efficient. Now, the downside is we don't know if pathogens will survive the process or not. We're currently initiating a project to validate it and answer that question, and so those results should be coming in the next year or so. Relatively inexpensive and quick, but the consideration is that it is still an innovative technology undergoing field trials and validations testing. So there's some risk with incorporating it into a plan right now. So this is an eye chart to test your vision. I apologize. We've gone over, those options, landfill rendering, and so on. We've talked about each of them individually, but then how do they compare to one another? Well, that's what this matrix does. It compares all of the options, and I took the pros and cons that were on the previous slides from this matrix, and this matrix was developed by a panel of subject matter experts over about a year's time, looking at not only public health risk, but all sorts of risks: biosecurity, pathogen inactivation, environmental sustainability, cost, and so on. And it came out, and it's highly footnoted, and it's available for you to review at your leisure, and I'll tell you about that at the end. But the bottom line is, when you compare them one against each other with this weighted criteria, it turns out that landfill rendering and offsite incineration are by far the safest, cheapest, fastest, best alternatives. And that's in large part because they were designed to dispose of waste safe. Composting is also a very favorable option. It's expected that Aboveground Burial will be right in the neighborhood of composting there. And noting that composting, open-air burning, and on-site burial are all on-farm alternatives, so those can be very attractive to responders. But if you look at the bottom scores, 4.7, 4.6, 4.4, 4.1, those are all, kind of in line with each other, and then you have a big drop for open-air burning and burial, which is by far the least favorable option, and that is proven and validated again and again. So if you believe that matrix and you want to make a plan to dispose of carcasses for your premises or your state, you might start with the most favorable option, which is landfill, and figure out if you can do that. But if you're really concerned about transporting, you can start with the on-site options. So I've shown that here in this loop. And we have tools to help you answer these questions. Is in-house composting feasible, or outdoor composting? There are checklists to help you answer those questions. And I'll show you those at the very end, which we're nearing now. A couple of quick topics I wanted to touch on. One is transport. I mentioned that it can be done safely. We commissioned a risk assessment with the University of Minnesota, and they found that if you used a render haul vehicle shown in the top photograph with a biozip type liner that's disinfected and securely tarped, that has negligible risk of transmitting foot and mouth disease virus from infected carcasses to healthy herds along the route. The render haul vehicles may be hard to come by, so we used roll-off containers with biozip liners in 2015. That was found to have a low risk, and we did not observe any increased outbreaks because of that transport. But the old way that people have traditionally done, which is called the burrito wrap, where they used a couple layers of plastic in a truck and loaded in the animals and then folded it over and disinfected it, that carries a moderate risk. And then there is one other option that we're also considering, and that is because there is so much concern about transporting infected materials, and because the disposal facilities are so concerned about receiving infected materials, is there a way to process them on the farm so that they're not infected when they leave the farm? We had commissioned a feasibility study to look at all the possible on-farm pre-treatment alternatives. And what it concluded was that grinding in an enclosure, so I've just kind of indicated some pictures here, with the addition of citric acid was the most feasible option for cost effectiveness, implementability, and so on. So that is something that we're investigating, and hopefully we'll have a process that could be used in the future. One last point on storage. If you follow that traditional thinking of depopulation within 24 hours, even if it's possible, you really need to have your disposal lined up to happen immediately because, which can be difficult. You have to think in advance. So, for example, we were able to depopulate birds in this photograph showing a foam system for poultry in 2015. We could depopulate them in a day. But then if we wanted to compost, we had to assemble equipment and operators and the subject matter experts and wood chips and, set it up, the decontamination stations and all that. And that could take time. So if you haven't planned in advance to get that there right when the birds are put down, you're going to have storage. And that storage pile is found to have some risks associated with it, not only attracting flies, but also potentially animal scavenging, leakage, and airborne transport. So another risk assessment that we commissioned found that if you covered the staged materials and contained the liquids, you would mitigate that risk. I'm sure your heads are exploding with all this information. It is a complex subject. We're just scratching the surface. We have developed two things to help people wade through this and make decisions about disposal. One is the APHIS Emergency Carcass Management Desk Reference Guide that we published a few months ago. This is one example of how it helps you walk through the processes. It includes the matrix with the decision loops and the checklists. And this is a breakdown of how you would go through the in-house composting process. If you decided it was going to work at your site, it tells you to deploy your composting SME, conduct a farm assessment, and it has links to protocols, what kind of carbon material you need, how to construct the windrows, how to monitor them, and all of those items. So that's available. The desk reference guide is available from me. Just shoot me an email, either as a PDF or even a hard copy in a binder with tabs. We have both. And to further facilitate this, we have linked the disposal reference, the desk reference guide, to some other calculators on a dashboard, which is currently in beta testing. It's expected to deploy on the APHIS website within the next month or so. And we hope that you will look for it, and I will certainly send out the information when it goes live, and hope that it's helpful. So here's my contact information, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as we move to Q&A, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please then state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. To submit a written question, please use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen and choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. And it does appear that we have one question in the queue. Caller, your line's been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Lori. This is Al Kane with APHIS in Fort Collins. Could you describe, in general, the NEPA compliance work that APHIS might have done in advance for particularly large mammal carcass disposal?
Yes, thank you. Great question. So NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act, and it requires all federal agencies to assess the environmental impact of any actions they take. And so if APHIS pays for disposing of carcasses during an outbreak, that is an action. And even though APHIS may not have made the disposal decision, that's really something the state needs to make in compliance with their state regulations. We are still responsible for ensuring that those disposal operations are done in accordance with all federal, state, and local regulations. We did a programmatic environmental impact statement for carcass management. It is available on the APHIS website. And anytime there's an outbreak, we then do a specific environmental assessment of that outbreak and point back to the programmatic environmental impact statement. Does that answer your question, Al?
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Lori, we we have a written question, and it says, my question is, do you have data that incineration can destroy prions?
Yes. So that is an internationally accepted protocol. It's the only one that's accepted globally for destruction of prions. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit is, I think it's just shy. I believe it's 1560. I'd have to double check the exact temperature. But yes, there is international data available that incineration destroys prions. And I'm happy to provide that information if you want to shoot me an email.
As a reminder, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
To ask a verbal question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate you wish to ask a question. If you would like to submit a written question, please use the chat panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and address your question to all panelists. Thank you. There are currently no additional questions in the queue.
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending. This was recorded, correct?
Correct, and we will send out, I'll send out information on when it'll be posted, probably within the next week.
Thank you so much, Liz. And, you know, if folks have made note of my email address on that last slide, please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like links to documents, articles, or the desk reference guide. So thank you all very much, and appreciate your attention.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank everybody again for signing on to the webinar today. We have a lot of webinars coming up in the next coming months. Be sure to watch your email for the Save the Date announcement, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining today's presentation. The event has now concluded, and you may disconnect.